So by raise of hands, how many of you guys have heard some form of an argument about homosexuality in regards to the Bible? Yeah, it is a very hot debate topic that is still going on and has been lasting for years, and whether the Bible actually condemns homosexual acts or if it's about something else entirely. And it may seem in context with the Bible that homosexuality is something that is inherently sinful or something that needs to be condemned. With a modern understanding of how homosexual relations are, the issue doesn't seem to be homosexuality. The issue seems to be the harm committed by people who have an insatiable sexual desire. So one of the most popular stories comes from Genesis 19, which is Sodom and Gomorrah, and this story follows Lot welcoming two angels into his home, showing hospitality, and the men walking up to Lot's door and demanding to have sexual relations with these angels, and Lot denies them these sexual relations and instead offers up his daughters. And at the end of the story, the city of Sodom is destroyed because of the wickedness of the men who reside there. And the implications that come from this text is that homosexual relations are very much like sinful and wrong and leads to the punishment by God, and that rape can equate to attraction. And contrary to popular belief, attraction holds no weight in rape acts at all, and there are three different types of rape, which is sexual gratification, power and dominance, and aggressive rape. And Walter Bergman suggests that the narrative about homosexuality isn't about homosexuality in the story at all, but rather about gang rape, because the story doesn't focus on private homosexual acts, instead the city coming together trying to rape these guests. H.J. Thompson even suggests that the men of Sodom were actually heterosexual rather than homosexual. She even argues that the homosexual is a modern-day term that cannot really be used in the context of the past. And she also further exemplifies that homosexuality should not be considered sinful, but rather the acts of premeditated rape and inhospitality, because that is what the story is mostly focusing on. Romans 1, I hear, is used a lot less in terms against like homosexuality, but it's still very much important because this text actually includes women in on the topic. And the story follows the people rejecting God and refusing to show him thanks, so therefore God gives people up to their own desires, and from those desires they start to commit even more horrific acts. So the implications from this text can be that homosexual acts are an inversion, which basically means they deviate from the norm, and the norm back then was heterosexual sex, which would produce an heir, and that was very much an important thing back then. And from a more conservative standpoint, this can be read as a corruption of morals stemming from homosexuality, because after these acts were committed, people started to commit other sins. So Paul J. Ashmeyer states that the basis of Romans 1 can actually be about the universal sins and their consequences. And he even states that Paul, who wrote Romans 1, is more so talking about like people acting as their own God and purposely trying to reject God and rebel against him. And it is speculated that Paul wrote these letters around 55 to 64 AD, and back then it was very common for older Roman men to engage in patriarchal and dominant sex with male slaves and effeminate young men. So these were always done through rape, so there wouldn't be a very positive viewpoint on how homosexual acts really are. And Dale B. Martin even states that we understand these texts through a heterosexist view because that was a common thing back then, because heterosexuality led to an heir and it was very much common to see among people. And Dale even states that Paul believes marriage isn't even a way to express your sexual desires, but a way to diminish it. And Paul's views on sex were so extreme, it was actually puzzling to other people who shared similar views to him, because the complete absence of sexual desire is very much implausible. So in conclusion, the Bible isn't really talking about homosexuality on the orientation of itself, but rather as an understanding of diminishing one's manhood. Back then, it was very much important, and there was a very strict hierarchy on how sex would work. Women were the ones supposed to be penetrated, while men were supposed to be the ones penetrating women. And this could explain why Lot offered up his daughters to be raped instead of the men who he was housing in his home, because he was trying to protect their manhood from being taken from them. And then overt sexual desire was something that you need to avoid, and that was very much important in Paul's view, because he didn't want people to have their minds corrupted by their sexual desire, and have their ability taken away by showing their faith in God. And though homosexual desire back then might have been seen as unnatural, it probably wasn't even for the act itself, but as the understanding as an overflow of sexual desire, because again, from a homosexual would not produce an heir, while a heterosexual would produce an heir. So it was more so understood that you would want to produce an heir. And though these texts are very much controversial because for years they have been used to hurt people under the queer label, there's actually a lot more nuance to them that tends to get ignored in support of other people's biases. And here are my sources.